Good evening. We are thankful that you're with us tonight. Glad that you're out here with us on a Wednesday night. Lord willing, we're going to move out of Leviticus chapter 18 tonight. I feel kind of weird. I hadn't done this in a while. But we'll be moving out of Leviticus chapter 18 tonight into chapter 19. There are a few copies left, but they're the same copies or notes that you had from last time. All the way back, 3 months ago at this point, right? At the end of May. Lord willing, Brother Doug Sellers will be with us next week. He was the one who was unable to be with us on our summer series, and so Brother Doug's going to be with us next week. And so remember that, keep that in mind. After that, Lord willing, we're going to be trying to get through some Leviticus. It becomes some one-hitters. We're going to see that as we get into chapter 19, some laws that God's going to give them that we can hopefully make some application out of. But again, the plan is to get out of 18 tonight. You asked too many tough questions last time we were in 18, so we're moving on. And we'll be in chapter 19, Lord willing, tonight. So again, thankful that you're here. Brother Brent's going to lead us in a word of prayer here in just a moment. Before we do that, are there any updates that we need to have? Anybody on the prayer list that we need to remember? Yeah, I don't know if all of you saw today, but a fellow drove through Sonic. It wasn't a drive-through at that point. And so they said he had a medical episode, and so we want to be mindful of that poor fellow. Somebody else? Miss Patsy, want to remember her recovery? Marie Smith? Ray Smith. Yes, ma'am. Oh, really? Yes, I hadn't seen a whole lot. I don't watch the news a whole lot, but there was a shooting in a school in Georgia today. So let's remember those folks. Our world needs Jesus. We need people that are following Jesus, obeying Jesus. Somebody else? All right, Mr. Brent, whenever you're ready, sir.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are indeed thankful for this opportunity tonight to gather here. We are asking for your blessings, Lord, as we've just went over many members here and people in the community and that need your help, need our help. We ask that you bless us where we can bless them, and also, Lord, that you lay your hands upon the ones that need the medical healing. We are mindful, Lord, of one that hadn't been mentioned tonight, of Terry Carey. Be with him as he takes his treatments from time to time, and we ask you, Lord, to be over him, guide his healing, and be with him especially. We are thankful, Lord, that we can gather here tonight, and we ask that you give Chris a good recollection of what he has prepared. Give us open hearts that we can receive it. Put it on our minds that we can go out in the community and use this information that we gather here tonight. Lord, as we continue, we ask that we do everything according to your will, and everything that we do be a glory unto you. These blessings and prayers we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, so like I said, we're in chapter 18 of Leviticus. Appreciate so much you sticking with me through this. I think it's a good study. Several I've talked to are excited about the study. I enjoy a study of Leviticus. We're moving out of chapter 18, and just to refresh your memory where we were 3 months ago, chapter 18 is all the sexual abominations and things that are going on, and talking about people that you're not supposed to have sex with. Men are not supposed to have sex with men. Women are not supposed to have sex with women. There's certain family relationships that are not supposed to be involved in. Bestiality is a sin. A lot of these different things that he talked about. And so we've kind of dealt with all that. And so we want to move into the end of this in verse 24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, talking about these sexually immoral things, and also idolatry was mentioned as well in there, which I am casting out before you have become defiled. So here's the picture that we see here, is that the land is vomiting these inhabitants out of it, these Canaanites, okay? It is getting rid of these Canaanites, and the reason it's getting rid of them is because of these grievous, terrible sins, and especially in chapter 18, these sexual sins that it's involved in. This land is spitting them, vomiting them out. God is using Israel to come in and punish them because of this sin that they were committing. And so he's going to drive them out of the land. What's the lesson? Don't you do the same thing. Right, sometimes, you have a child and that child does something and you punish that child for something, and the other three you say, did you see that? Don't do that. Right? This is the punishment. You keep on, you do this same thing, you're going to be punished as well. And so I think that's what God is really teaching these folks is that, listen, you came out of Egypt, they were doing things you ought to not be doing. You're going into a land of Canaan, they're doing things you ought to not be doing. It spit them out. It's going to spit them out through you. You came out of Egypt, it was punished because of it. And listen, you fool around, you do those things, you'll be punished as well. And so I think that's the idea that he's talking about here. Verse 25, for the Lord has become, the land has become defiled. Therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so that the land has spewed out, that's what I was saying, vomiting, spewed out its inhabitants. But as for you, you are to keep my statutes and my judgments, and shall not do any of these abominations, neither the native nor the alien who sojourns among you. And so the idea again here is, of course, their law is God-based. We have a different kind of law. Their law was God-based, where God was making the rules, and so all of their laws came from God. And so God's saying, listen, here's the law for you, but not only for you, for those that are aliens or strangers or sojourners in your land. It's not just that you people have to keep this law, but the people inside your land, okay, this promised land, have to keep these laws. For the men of the land who have been before you have done all these abominations, and the land has become defiled, so that the land will not spew you out, should you defile it, as it has spewed out the nations which has been before you. For whoever does any of these abominations, these persons who do them so shall be cut off from among the people. Thus you are to keep my charge, that you do not practice any of the abominable customs which have been practiced before you, so as not to defile yourselves with them. And so why? Why, God? Why? Well, what does he say? I am the Lord your God. I remember there would be times where my dad would say something and we'd be like, well, why? And he might humor us and might say, something, but eventually it gets to the point of, listen, I'm your daddy, you're going to do what I said. Yes, sir, right? I mean, that's what it comes down to. God, why? Listen, you're going to do these things. Why? Because I am the Lord your God. I know what's best for you. I know what's right for you. You need to obey these things. Look what happened to the people before you. The land spews them out through you. The land will spew you out if you don't obey as well. And so what are we going to see? They're not going to obey. We're going to see the northern kingdom taken into captivity, and eventually the southern kingdom taken into captivity. The Babylonian captivity by the southern kingdom, I believe, and the Assyrian captivity by the northern kingdom. The land's going to spew them out as well because of their sin. But God's warning them here at the beginning. Why do we do this? Because I am the Lord your God. Here's a lesson I think we need to know. God's not just the God of our worship. As one commentator put it, He's also the God of our bedroom. God should have ultimate control over every aspect of our lives. We don't like that. We like to compartmentalize God, don't we? We like to say, I'm going to put God here in the worship. I'll put God here in this. But listen, He's the God of my work. He's the God of my family. He's the God of my bedroom. He's the God of my money. The list could go on and on. Everything of my life, He's the God of. And that's what He says here. There's a certain way you ought to live, a certain way you ought to act. It ought to be different than the inhabitants of the land where you came from and the inhabitants of the land where you're going. You ought to be different. We're going to see that especially in chapter 19. Why? Because I'm the Lord your God. Any questions or comments before we move out of 18? Okay, so if you have your paper here, if you brought it back or if you got a new one down there, we're on page 24, number 2, I believe, is where we're at. Number 2, the practice of what two pagan nations were prohibited by the Lord. Letter A is Egypt. That's where they came out of, Egypt. And then letter B would be Canaan. That's the land they're going into. Examples of this, what we're talking about, letter A, the practice of child sacrificing. We saw that just briefly in chapter 18. We'll see it more as we go through the rest of this. But they would sacrifice their children to Molech. Terrible, 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 terrible. Did I tell you about what Molech, if I understand correctly, they fire his hands up. He has hands. They fire his hands up, and they'll take their infant children and lay them and have them scald to death to sacrifice to these. They play the drums really loud so the parents can't hear the screaming and crying. Don't sacrifice to this God, which makes sense when you live in a very promiscuous, sexually promiscuous culture that they would have lived in. There would have been a lot of children, and they would sacrifice them to these idols. It's terrible. That's a terrible thing. Canaanites sacrificed their children to Molech, the fire god, a Canaanite idol. You can see Jeremiah 7 and verse 31. That's how far God's people are going to eventually get from him, where they're going to take their infant children and put them on scalding hot metal and have them killed. That's how far eventually they're going to get away from God. Letter B, cult prostitution associated with idolatry. Usually idolatry had cult prostitution. Again, we'll see that as we get into chapter 19. Corinth was famous for that in the New Testament. They like to have fertility gods. Fertility gods would make the crops grow, would make the animals reproduce and all that. They worship these fertility gods in sexual ways. And so God's saying, listen, don't you do like those people that you came out of. Don't you do like those people that you're going into. You're to be different. You're to be holy because I am holy. All right, any questions on 18? Like I said, we spent some time there last time we were together. Great, glad you didn't have me. 19. 19. Then the Lord spoke to Moses saying, so again, throughout this, what have we seen? God speaking to Moses, telling Moses, speak to the people. Here's what I want them to know. And so we've seen this throughout Leviticus. If you've been through here the whole time, you know this. Speak to all the congregation of the sons of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy. So again, we finished 18 with this idea, and now we're back into chapter 19. I believe we'll see it about the middle of this chapter and at the end of the chapter as well. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now, again, we think about this being Old Testament, we go, well, maybe that doesn't really apply to us. But the New Testament would call us to do the same thing, would it not? 1 Peter would talk about the idea that we are to be holy because God is holy. And so that's the idea. We're to be called apart, separated from the world, different than the world. That's what he's telling these folks. You aren't supposed to be like the Egyptians that you came out of. You're not supposed to be like the Canaanites you're going into. You're supposed to be different. Here's some ways you're going to be different, okay? And that's what we're really supposed to be, is different. Different in the way we think and the way we speak and the way that we dress and the things that we do, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to be different. What's one of the greatest sins in our culture? Being different. Scares us to death, right? I don't want to swim opposite of everybody else. I want to go along and get along, right? And yet God calls us as his people to be different. Holy is what he says here. Verse 4. Yes, sir. So redeemed is the idea of being bought back. And so we've sold ourselves into slavery of sin, and so God has had to pay a price to buy us back. We were his at one point, and then we sold ourselves, and so he's bought us back. And that's the concept of redeemed. When he redeems us, he makes us holy. And so holy and redeemed would be a little bit different. Holy is the concept of set apart. When he has bought us back, when he's redeemed us, he has set us apart. He's made us holy is the idea. So there's a little bit of difference in that aspect, I think. If you're holy, you should. Yes, you've been redeemed. Okay. As long as it's not the beginning of 18, we're okay. Yeah, I would agree with Don. You can't be holy unless you've been redeemed. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said what was the difference in those two. Oh, I got you. Yeah. Yeah, I can't make myself holy. God makes me holy, but he does that by redeeming me, setting me apart.
So they set themselves apart.
Who's the they there?
The people who were holy.
Well, God has set us apart, and then we set ourselves apart as well. I do think but the fact that I've been redeemed, I'm one of the children of God now, and I need to walk in that holiness. I need to continue in that holiness. Is that what you're asking? Okay. Was that did I get out of that easy enough? Somebody else? All right, where are we at? Verse 3, I think. Every one of you shall reverence his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbath. I am the Lord your God. So we're going to see the Ten Commandments kind of play out through this chapter, mostly play out through this chapter. And the first thing that God says is, listen, your mom and daddy, you honor them, you pay attention to them. One of the greatest problems within our culture today is lack of respect for parents. But that goes back to that the parents are really not doing what God has said. So often there are fathers, if we could use that word, right? I mean, biologically, they're impregnating women, women are having children, and they're absent from the whole thing. Sometimes it's the mother that's absent from the whole thing. God knew what he was doing when he designed the family unit of having a father and a mother to raise the children. And what are the children to do? The children, if you've watched television, sitcoms and things like that, I remember, especially when I was younger, when we watched those kind of things, the kid was the smartest one in the room, right? The kid had all the answers. Dad was a bumbling idiot. Mom was kind of checked out, whatever it was. And the kid was the smartest one. And so I'm afraid we've kind of trained our children that they're smarter than their parents. And a lot of kids think that now. And maybe the case is sometimes. I will grant you that. But it's not going to be the most of the time. And we need children that are honoring their parents. If you can't learn to honor your father and mother, how will you ever learn to honor God, who is the ultimate Father? So not only does he say, number one, to honor your father and mother, but he says, next of all, remember my Sabbaths. There was an idea of putting God in his proper place, of taking the time to remember God and what God has done. And again, something that we would see in the New Testament as well today, God calling us to honor our father and mother, and not calling us to honor the Sabbath day, but calling us to remember him, to set aside time to remember him, because he is God. Questions or comments through this verse? Verse 4, do not turn to the idols or make for yourselves molten gods. So again, we're on this Ten Commandment idea. I am the Lord your God. So not only do you remember me, but make sure you don't bring anything else in. We will see throughout the history of Israel, one of the things they would do is they would remember God, but he would be a God, not the God. You would see them worship under every tree and every high place there is. They'd bring in other idols and problems and things. And God is really saying here, I think, listen, I am the God. You worship me, not all this other stuff. And so I think we see this concept here in verse 4. Questions, comments? 5. Now when you offer a sacrifice of peace offering to the Lord, you shall offer it so that you may be accepted. It shall be eaten the same day you shall offer it, and the next day. But what remains until the third day shall be burned with fire. So if it is eaten all on the third day, it is an offense. It will not be acceptable. Everyone who eats it will bear his iniquity, for he has profaned the holy thing of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from the people. Now, you remember we talked about a peace offering all the way back in chapter 7 and another place. We talked about the peace offering, and so when you ate this peace offering, or when you had this peace offering, one of the things that came about, if you remember, was a fellowship meal, okay? We might refer to it as. And so they would have a church eat church. No, I'm just kidding. They would have a fellowship meal after the sacrifice. And so you would give part of that to the priest of this sacrifice that you've made. You would also invite your friends, your neighbors, your relatives. You would invite people to come in and celebrate with you, eat with you. And so what it's saying here is, listen, if you make that sacrifice, day 1, eat that. Day 2, you eat that. But on day 3, if you eat that, it's an abomination to me. And so my thinker starts going, well, why in the world is the third day an abomination? There are possibly some health reasons to it, okay, but I think those would be secondary. And maybe some of the commentary that I read said that it's a lack of trusting in God. And I don't know, maybe there's something to that concept. Is that, will God continue to provide for me? I got to hold on to this. I got to save this. I got to hold and eat this later on. And so maybe it's a lack of trusting in God. Another thing that they made mention of, and maybe there's some truth to this as well, is it could be that you got very stingy, right? Man, we sacrificed a good cow and got some good meat. And listen, I don't want to give that to the neighbor down the street. They didn't bring their trash cans in like they're supposed to. Or I don't want the neighbors on the other side of the street. They don't mow their grass. Like, I ain't giving them no cow. And so I'm going to hoard what I have. Remember relative so-and-so, they didn't talk to me last Thanksgiving. I ain't inviting them to the feast. And so maybe it was one of those things of preventing this concept of hoarding. It was one of those things that was supposed to be a blessing to others. Or maybe I don't like the priest. I don't like the priest, and I don't want to go make this offering and him get a part of it. And so maybe that's kind of the idea as well, is that they were being very greedy or selfish by holding on to these things and keeping it to that third day, where God's saying, listen, you've received, freely give. I don't know, but those things make some sense to me as I kind of study that, why God might say that. You had to burn it on the third day, or it was an abomination. But it's repeating what we've already studied. And in this context seems to be about how we treat other people, okay, in chapter 19. So it may very well be the answer to why God had said this, is because they were being selfish or greedy and not sharing with others. And again, we'll see as we go through this chapter some more about that. Any questions on the peace offering?
What does it mean to be cut off? Did they put them out of the camp?
I think it could be. We're going to see, I don't think this is the case here, but we're going to see in chapter 20 where they would kill you for capital punishments for different things. I think there were 16, if I remember correctly, things that they would kill you for. And I don't think that's what cut off here means for this, but that could be an ultimate response, or it could be an ultimate thing of being cut off. Here it might be exiled, it might be put out, I don't know, or it might be shunned in the community. I'm not exactly sure what it means, Mr. Bobby, but some of those things might play into that idea. Somebody else? All right, we move on to verse 9. Now, when you reap the harvest of your land. All right, so this is why it flows possibly that these sacrifices that they were to give, they were to be generous with. Why? Because verse 9 is going to talk about being giving as well. So when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap the very corners of your field, nor shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest, nor shall you glean your vineyard, nor shall you gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall have them for the needy and for the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Now, I don't know about y'all, but listen, if I'm cutting a field, I'm cutting every bit of that, right? I mean, if you leave the edges and the corners, you're leaving profit out there, right? In fact, what might you do? You might send some people back, right? Listen, go back. They picked that apple tree. Go back there and see if there's any apples that fell down that were good. Why? Because that's profit. And yet God is saying, no. When you cut your fields, you leave the edges, you leave the corners. I don't know exactly how much that involves, okay? And maybe that's a hard issue with some people. But you're to leave the edges and the corners. If you go through your vineyards and you cut your grapes and the vine cutters go all the way through, and you go back and you see, man, they missed one or two. Don't cut those, leave those. If you go back through your orchard and you notice, man, there's 4, 5, 10, 15 good apples here, or whatever fruit that you see, and you don't pick those up, you leave those. Why? Because there's people in your land that are needy, that are hungry. And so he specifically mentions those that maybe are poor or are needy, but he also mentions the sojourner, or the one who doesn't have a home, who's just passing through. It's interesting. It's interesting to me. You know what Jesus does? He goes to the grain field and picks. And possibly this is a reference to what Jesus is going to do in the New Testament, where he goes through and picks the heads of grain. I don't know, but it's possible that's a reference to this. But that was the purpose, to take care of the needy. A couple of lessons. One lesson that I want to think of, first of all, God expected these. There were cases where people couldn't do this. There were needy people, blind man and things of that sort that could not do things like this. But God had, I think, an expectation of people to work. And benevolence wasn't one of these things of just helping people that wouldn't help themselves. But listen, if you're hungry, it's out here. I get tickled because I remember when I worked in Western Kentucky, we had this person, they needed some food or whatever. And I said, man, come on down. I said, I got a garden full of stuff. You're welcome to anything in it. And they're like, well, I don't know if I get a ride out there, you know. Wait a minute, if I gave you some money or if I gave you, you know, I think they're probably going to have a ride. But it was like, hey, I got a garden full of stuff. You come pick what you want to. And it was a really clean garden. I mean, it wasn't like you were having to wade through waist-high weeds or anything. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Oh, no, I don't think I can do that. And so that's the problem sometimes. Benevolence is turned into assisting people and being lazy. That being said, we ought to be assisting people that need help. And so I don't want you to miss either side here. There are people that have no business asking, but there are people that do, and we want to be generous when people are in need. Number one, and we don't want to assist people that don't need help. Questions or comments here? All right, why? Because I am the Lord your God. I said about halfway. It was before halfway through. It's right here where God said that. Verse 11, you shall not steal, nor deal falsely, nor lie to one another. All right, so again, we're thinking about these 10 commandments here, and we're talking about our relationship with other people. Don't steal from people, okay? Don't deal falsely with people, because we can steal, even though maybe we don't tell a lie. We can shade something our way, or we can make something look better or whatever. Don't deal falsely with people. We're going to see here in just a moment, he's going to talk about differing weights. That's how they would measure things out, buy and sell things. Don't lie to people. Don't steal from people. Treat people right. And so that's what he tells us here. Verse 12, you shall not swear falsely by my name, so as to profane the name of the Lord your God. Or excuse me, to profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So again there he emphasizes that. And what is the idea here? The whole idea, and a lot of this stuff is New Testament stuff. We can look at New Testament stuff about stealing, about lying, and we can look at stuff about let your yes be yes, let your no be no. We live in a world where people are crafting the words that they say to say specific things, to get around certain things, and not to be very honest. And I think as God's people, God calls us to let our yes be yes and our no be no. And in this category, what they were doing is they were swearing, they were using the name of God to tell that they were telling the truth. Listen, just tell the truth. You don't have to swear. Be the kind of person that tells the truth that people can know. Listen, if he looks you in the eye and he shakes your hand, that's the way that's going to be. We used to live in that kind of world, right? Now we got to sign 4 billion pieces of paper to get bubble gum out of a machine because people don't trust us anymore, right? And so as the people of God, you and I ought to be people that when we say yes, it's yes. When we say no, it's no. We need to be people of our word and not using the Lord's name to swear to those things. He goes on and says, you shall not oppress your neighbor nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you all night until morning. So what are we talking about here? It's the idea of an employer and employee, okay? You get a man that comes in, he works for you. Most likely in this society, we're probably dealing with people that living paycheck to paycheck. And what I mean by that is this. They work this day, they get paid that night, they take it to the market, they buy food, their family eats that night. I don't know about you, but I'm blessed that I don't worry about that. I don't worry about that. I can't imagine. Could you imagine that you had an employer that said, I'll pay you in the morning? Could you imagine coming home to a family of maybe 6 or 7, your wife, your little children, hungry, ready to eat, and you don't have anything because your employer said, I'll pay you in the morning. That's not right. And so what we would see here is the principle of employer treating employee correctly. We would see that in the New Testament as well in some examples. And so that's what he's saying here, is you need to treat people right. You need to treat your employees right. Verse 14, you shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind, but you shall revere your God. I am the Lord. So again, we see that idea. What's the idea here? Listen, we ought to not make fun of people. We ought to not belittle people. We ought to not take advantage of people, especially those who have handicaps. And so what's the idea? Well, you got a deaf man, and he doesn't know what you're saying, and you're just giving him a good cussing, right? And everybody else is just laughing, and he's lost. He doesn't know what in the world's going on, unless he reads lips, right? He doesn't know what in the world's going on, and everybody's laughing at him, and he's the butt of the joke. Or the idea of a blind man, here he is walking along, and you're like telling your buddies, hey, watch this, and here you stick something in front of him, and bloop, he falls right over it. That says something about you. That says something about the people that laugh at that. God says, don't treat people that way. Don't treat people that way. And we would see that in the New Testament as well. Treat people like you want to be treated. How would you feel if you were the deaf man? How would you feel if you were the blind man? And so that's what I think God is talking to us about here. We move on, verse 15. You shall do no injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor, nor defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. From my understanding of their judicial system, they would go to the city gate. Okay, that's where court would be held. And so if you had a dispute, if you had some kind of problem, you would go to the city gate. A lot of times the older men would sit at the city gate, and they would be the ones that make this call. Okay, and so, but what if they weren't? What if it could have been any of us at the city gate called to make a judgment call? And so you've got a poor man that comes in, and he pleads his case, and you've got a sympathetic heart to the poor guy. And so you pervert justice a little bit because you feel sorry for him. God says, no, don't do that. Or a rich man comes in and he pleads his case and he's guilty as all get out, right? But if you side with him, maybe he's going to help you out a little bit because you got a little problem. And so you side with him because that's going to help you out. God says, don't do that. You get a poor man in, you judge him fairly. You get a rich man in, you judge him fairly. And that's what God's calling us to do. I think that we would see that throughout the New Testament as well, is that we are to judge fairly. Maybe the book of James would speak to that a little bit as well. Of course, we're not going to be judges in the sense of civil cases, but being right or treating people the right way. Verse 16. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people, and you are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So 2 principles here he gives us. Number 1, not to be slandering. Again, we would see New Testament evidence as well. We've got to watch our tongue. The tongue is so easily gets us in trouble. It gets me in trouble, and maybe the rest of you have tamed her. I have not. She gets me in trouble. Number 1, your tongue. Number 2, he doesn't say don't murder here. He says, we go back, again, let's read it. He says, are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord. So what does he mean by that? Because that's worded kind of strangely. It's not talking about murder. Evidently, it's talking about maybe if you had someone that you could help, to help them. Or if, for instance, maybe you were hearing a cry of someone calling for help, they were harmed or hurt, and you could help them, is the idea. Don't do anything that might cost someone their life. Don't neglect them, but help them. May be the idea here, which looks like he's really saying we have a responsibility to help. We have a responsibility to help these folks. Let's see, verse 17. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart, nor may countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but shall not incur sin because of him. There's an interesting thought that I don't know the day, maybe the first day I've had this thought. In the New Testament, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, and starting there in Matthew chapter 25, you hear Jesus say things like, you have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And so I think a lot of times that has been talked about. A lot of people have explained it that they were doing that the law of Moses was about the actions and not necessarily the heart. I don't know. I feel like I've heard that for a majority of my life, and in fact thought probably that was the case. That was what was going on. I'm not sure that's the case. Why? Because what we just read. You shall not hate. That's a feeling, right? And so we're going to see some other passages in the law of Moses going to talk about our emotions. So maybe what was going on is the way that these Pharisees had interpreted, or these Jewish people had interpreted these laws to be solely outward and not inward as well. And I don't know, but I think there's some validity to that. Because when you look at these passages in the Old Testament, God is dealing with the heart as well. We're going to see here, verse 18, you love your neighbor as yourself in essence. And so he's dealing with not only the action, but he's dealing with the heart. Again, verse 17, you shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. What happens if you hate him in your heart? It's going to come out in your life, right? You may surely reprove your neighbor. But what if my neighbor does something to me? Go to him. Talk to him. So we got an agricultural society, right? And your neighbor's cow gets out, gets in your property, tears all your tulips up, or eats your tomato plants, or whatever the thing does. Go talk to your neighbor, right? Listen, your cow's out. It ate all my tomato plants and tore up all my wife's tulips, man. Well, let's deal with that. That's what the man who owns the cow ought to do, right? The first guy ought to go to him and tell him, and that second guy who owns that cow ought to come and say, "Hey, let me give you my tomatoes this year. Let me get you some more tulips planted, so your wife won't be unhappy with you." Okay? And so that's what he's saying. Go to him, tell him what's going on, but shall not incur sin because of him. Deal with it, and move on. I think that's what the idea here is. You can't go to him, or you can't just hate him because his cow gets out, or you can't just take his cow back and tell him and he fixes these things and you still hate him. And I think that's what's going on here, is this idea of this lingering anger that carries on even though you've tried to deal with it. So deal with it, I think is what he's saying. And then verse 18, you shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So again, I think we think so often the Old Testament is void of emotion, but where did Jesus get this from? From Leviticus. The first commandment is love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? The second is like it, love thy neighbor as thyself. Where did he get that from? Leviticus. That's where he pulled it from. So the Old Testament dealt with the heart as well, and I'm not sure that I always see it that way, but it does. It does. So people are going to sin against you. Things are going to happen. You're going to get aggravated. You're going to get upset. Deal with those things. Matthew chapter 18, I think, would talk to us about that as Christians. Your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault. And so some of these principles are still going on. I've taught for a long time. I'll be quiet. Anybody got any questions? I'll take that as you like to hear my voice. Okay. 19. You are to keep my statutes. You shall not breed together two kinds of your cattle. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor wear a garment upon you of two kinds of material mixed together. There are some difficult things in chapter 19, and to me this is one of those passages. Why? And let me say this up front. I don't know. Why did God... It's possibly, and I would say that if anything, it's a secondary benefit, that in some way this is helping them, some kind of health benefit. Maybe they would have bred the cows, it would have caused inferior cows. Maybe the clothes would have torn if they had put two things together. I don't know. There may be a benefit to them. Usually God's laws have a benefit, but I think that would be a secondary thing. My best guess from what I've studied and what I've looked at is this is what the Canaanites did. Remember we talked about that, at the end of chapter 18, how that the Canaanites were doing certain things and this was an abomination. So maybe the Canaanites, their culture did things like this. And because of that, God says, I want you to be different. And so you're not to do things that the Canaanites did, like breeding two different cows or or sowing your field with 2 different kinds of seeds, or wearing clothes that have 2 different materials. I don't know. I'm just shooting straight with you. I don't know exactly why God said that, but that's my guess, is it some way keeps them distinguished from the Canaanites and the Egyptians, and there may be some kind of benefit to them in the long run. But that's the best that I know with that passage. If you know better than I do, teach me. That was an invitation. Okay, that's all I got with it, guys. I don't know. I don't know any more than that. That's what I've got with that passage. It may have meant something more in that time frame than what I know and understand at this point. Verse 20. Yes, sir.
We do know that they were told not to wear clothes that would confuse people as to whether you were a male or a female.
Yes, there is that. Yes, they were to wear men's clothes. Men were to wear men's clothes and such. Yes, that is true. Again, there may be an object lesson here. I don't know. It may be an object lesson. They weren't to mix with the Canaanites. And so in that object lesson, they weren't to mix different cows. They weren't to mix different seeds. That's a little bit, possibly, I don't know. But that's the best I've got with this. 20. Now, if a man lies carnally with a woman, we're going to get all the favorite passages right here together. If a man lies carnally with a woman who is a slave, acquired for another man, but who has in no way been redeemed, nor given her freedom, there shall be a punishment that shall not, the punishment, they shall not, however, be put to death, because she was not free. He shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord and to the doorway of the tent of meeting, a ram of a guilt offering. The priest shall also make atonement for him with the ram of the guilt offering before the Lord his God, before his sin which he has commanded, and the sin which he has committed will be forgiven him. Okay, what in the world is that talking about? Yeah, that's another one of the difficult passages. Here's what I think we're dealing with here. So you've got a free man, a married free man, who commits a sexual act with a slave woman. We're going to see in chapter 20 that one of the stonable offenses is adultery. Okay? In fact, you see in John chapter 8, right? When the woman is caught in adultery, they're going to pick up stones to stone her, because that's a stonable offense in the Old Testament. Adultery is. Wouldn't that change adultery today? Wow, right? So adultery is a stonable offense. So the situation that's been given here is you've got this married man who has intercourse with this slave woman, but she is a slave. She has not been redeemed. She's not free. Now, I don't know. We've talked about the slavery idea in the sense that she could have sold herself into slavery. I don't know. I don't know how she got there, but she is not free and she's not redeemed. So, under the law, what are you supposed to do with these 2 people? You're supposed to kill them. They're supposed to be stoned for their adultery. And so it looks like God has come back and said, in this specific case, you don't do that. The question becomes why? Why do you? And I don't think it's rape. Okay? So sometimes I think people would go here and go, well, it's rape. I don't think it's rape. Okay? I think God would have clarified that. I think it's a consensual sexual relationship between the 2 of them. You don't stone them to death. Why? I don't know. I don't really know. Okay? I think my opinion is because it would do harm to the man she has sold herself to, in essence, by having her killed. And so what they did was wrong, but if they were to kill both of them for that, it would commit another wrong toward him. And so because of that, they don't stone them. The man will have to make atonement or sacrifice. He'll have to pay for his offense, but that's what God had commanded. That's the best that I know with it. I don't know exactly why other than that. Marvin, did you have your hand up?
Well, it does seem common for married men to have relations with single women and not be considered adultery in the Old Testament. Well, I think, is it adultery?
Yes, I think it would be adultery if they're married and have a sexual relationship with either a married woman or a non-married woman. It would be adultery. So, That's the best I know with this. Again, it may be one of those things of why can't you wear a shirt that's got two different fabrics in it. I don't know. It may have been more specific in that case. It looks like to me, though, that God is dealing with a specific case because later on he's going to command them to be killed. But in this situation, he's not. So why in this situation is he not? And the only thing I can think of is that maybe it deals with this man that owns this woman. I know we don't like the word own, but I mean, maybe she sold herself into that slavery, and we've already talked about that.
So, just because I'm confused, what about like concubines, like Solomon? Was that adultery? Because he had so many wives, and then he had concubines too, but they also wives? Because they seem like...
That's a really good question. I've never had concubines, so I don't really know the answer to that question. And so I'm hoping never to have that problem with Miss King. That's a good question. What is going on with Solomon, David, all those guys that seem to multiply wives, not only wives, but concubines as well, and what exactly is that? I don't know that I'd be prepared to give you an answer out of this, but that's a good question. Maybe I need to look up and study a little bit more. Somebody else? Okay, rolling on. Let's see. Verse 23. When you enter the land and plant all kinds of trees for food, then you shall count their fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It shall not be eaten. But in the 4th year, all of its fruit shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. Verse 25. In the 5th year, you are to eat of its fruit. That is, its yield may increase for you. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so what if we plant fruit trees? So here they are going into Canaan, and they get into the land, and they plant some trees. Now, if you've ever planted trees, you know that trees don't instantly do things. And so what I think we're dealing with here is Israelites were called to give the first fruits. The problem with that is these trees are probably not producing much. I don't know if any of you have ever grown trees. I had a peach tree, and you might get 1 peach, 2 peach, the first year, 2nd year, not many, 3rd year, not many. And so what I think he's dealing with here is there's not much. And so you don't touch those, you don't deal with those. Let that tree grow, let that tree get bigger, stronger, produce. And the 4th year, you're given the first fruits, okay? That is the first fruits of this tree, that 4th year. Hopefully by that 4th year, it's really beginning to produce and make a lot, and those things are given to God. In the 5th year, you can eat its produce. You don't give God the 4th year, it's not going to produce, I think what he's saying, like it's supposed to. You give it to God, what is it doing? It's saying, I trust you, God. Even though I got this food here and I could eat this food, I trust you to give me a harvest later on. And so the 5th year, you're allowed to eat of its fruit. That is my time tonight. Again, Lord willing, I will not be teaching class next week. Doug is going to be here. Sorry, his name just slipped my mind. Doug's going to be here and make up for the time that he wasn't able to be with us. And so after that, Lord willing, we'll get back into chapter 19. Thank you.